what is also important here is that while we are on this subject, let us also agree very clearly that he may be a maverick, but his principles are very deeply rooted in the fundamental principles of India and its Indian constitution, fundamentals of decency, of secularism, and so on and so forth. One is actually going to grapple with two wonderful books. They were earlier supposed to be one book, Memoirs of a Maverick and the Rajiv I Knew. But of course, as he's explained very eloquently in this, the first is of course a memoir, and his relationship with Rajiv Gandhi is something that he took out of the book to address it separately and just as well, because there is so much to unpack. I'll start with one of his favorite songs called My Way, and truly he's lived a life that is full, has traveled each and every highway and more and much more. He did it his way. And before I ask him the first question, one little trivia which may interest people in Goa. He commenced writing his first book of the two at the Silver Sands Beach Shack in Kandulim. And that's where it all began. So the first chapters were actually written right here on Goan soil. Mr. Aiyar, you speak a lot about your birth in Lahore and then the period of partition. And you actually say that partition is a nightmare that has haunted my life and politics. Over the years, how has this particular statement of yours played out?
Well, I don't really have any personal memories of Lahore at the time of partition because my parents were more or less separated, and my mother came with her children to Shimla in 1946, and my father stayed on in Lahore, where he had gone in 1927 to escape anti-Brahmin persecution in Tamil Nadu. So he became a refugee twice in his life, once for reasons of caste, and the second time for reasons of religion. And that's made me a secularist and a secular fundamentalist all my life. I don't think he should have been treated that way. But as it turned out, my first acquaintance with Pakistan was literally on the day and precisely at the minute when the surrender documents were being signed in Dhaka on the 16th of December 71. For I was in the Foreign Service at that stage. I was in the Economic Division of the Ministry of External Affairs. And I was appointed the secretary of a very high-powered committee that was looking into emergency supplies to Bangladesh to enable them to take back their refugees. And so for the first 6 or 7 months of 1972, I was in and out of Bangladesh, and because the Indian Army was still in Bangladesh, they had army helicopters which we could take for free, like taxis. And so I wandered all over the place, and I heard several atrocity tales of the Pakistanis against the Bangladeshis. And that made me curious to know what kind of a people the Pakistanis were. And most of my diplomatic life had been spent in Brussels, of all places, where I was dealing with international economic questions, including our relationship with the European Union at the time of the British accession. And my other posting had been to Vietnam, but that had lasted a very short time. And then I went to Iraq, where I saw a vicious dictatorship in operation. And it was about that time that the Morarji government decided to open up its relationship with Pakistan. And Foreign Minister Vajpayee visited Pakistan, and it was agreed to open a consulate in Karachi, where we used to have the Indian High Commission. So I rather hoped I would be chosen as the Consul General for Karachi. But as I had spent only 2 years in Baghdad, I didn't think that would be possible. So you can imagine my joy when I got a telegram telling me I had been appointed as the first ever Consul General to Karachi. And I went there expecting a very vicious reception. I chose the post because it was going to be a challenging post. But when I got there, I found that I was pushing against an open door, because the kind of reception we received from the people of Pakistan, ranging from very important politicians, very, very important politicians, all those who had worked with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And it was a time when Bhutto was hanged. So one would have expected a lot of tension. But they were released, the politicians, after a while. The first thing they wanted to do was to meet with me and in fact make some very subversive suggestions. I also found that none of the other consuls, neither the British, nor the UK, nor the US, nor the Chinese, nor the Saudi Arabian, had a quarter, had even 10% of the access to everybody that I had. And also the consulate was a very popular destination because lakhs of Indian Mahajir, as they were called, the refugees from India, had settled in Karachi or in the Sindh area, in Hyderabad, Sindh, or in Sakka, and they had not met with their families for 13 years. So the demand was so great that I used to have I was able to issue a lakh of visas within 5 months. Indeed, in my 3 years, I issued 3 lakh visas. And the amazing thing is that the Indian police never complained of any one of these people having misused their visas. So I came to the conclusion that India, which was secular, had taken the right path, and Pakistan, which had thought that religion could be the basis of nationhood, had gone completely wrong because they didn't understand that ethnicity matters, that religion matters, that all the points that Mama Andia made yesterday about the Northeast, it applies to all of Southeast Asia. And so it was essential to remain a secular country if we were not to become Pakistan and if we were not to have the country divided. Tragically, I think now that unity in diversity is being defeated by the alternative principle. It's not the same principle. It's the alternative principle of unity through uniformity. That is simply not going to work. And our future will be the same as Pakistan's if we go down the path that Pakistan chose, which is to impose uniformity through one religion, Islam, which was the only reason they broke away from us.
A lot of these values and principles seem to be rooted in your wonderful time at Wellams. In fact, that became a very nice melting pot of the entire country. And you also mentioned that you grew up when the dohas of Kabir and the anthems of Iqbal and Rabindra Sangeet were all a part of the whole milieu. And you go on to write that the idea of India as the inheritor of a broad, plural, multicultural, multi-religious civilization was all there and it stemmed. So, in the light of what you felt and what you wrote in your 80s now, and as you don't go into the twilight as yet, but you're still very active. But as you are growing older, how do you look back at this whole idea of India, which is perhaps not the same that you had?
Well, until I was about 75 years old, all Indians were secular except for closet communalists. In the last 10 years, all Indians are communal except for closet secularists. That has been the radical transformation I have seen over my life. And when I regret what has happened to India, to my daughters, who are all now in their 40s, reaching their 50s, they say you were so lucky. You lived most of your life through a secular India, and we, at the peak of our careers, are facing the problems of living in a non-secular India. So that has been the transformation and made it imperative for me to write about secular fundamentalism. Because all these people who are making a mess of our subcontinent were either Islamic fundamentalists in the 1940s or Hindu fundamentalists in the 2020s. And the only answer to them is secular fundamentalism. That I am as secular, I am as fundamentalist in my secular beliefs as you are in your religious beliefs. But the saving grace is that in my book, Confessions of a Secular Fundamentalist, which is available in the bookstore, but they have combined very cleverly, I think, the titles of my two books.
Yes.
One is The Memoirs of a Maverick, the other is Confessions of a Secular Fundamentalist, into the theme of this session as Memoirs of a Secular Fundamentalist. And that is, I think, a much more accurate description of what I like to think about. He mentioned Vellum. I would say that many of the things he's read out is really Doon School.
Also, yes. Yes.
And it never occurred to any of us to ask any other classmate or schoolboy which was the state he was from, what was his religion, why he should be identified with a particular language. There was an acceptance of secularism with a class-based society. So I became a communist while I was at school because I saw that there were a lot of rich boys who had nothing to their names except their wealth. And this made me feel that a class society is as bad as a communal society. I've had opportunity to modify my views on class since then, although basically I still remain an advocate of a classless society as much as a casteless society and as much as not a religionless society, but a society which is mukt, which is independent and liberated from religious prejudice, or what is now a very favorite expression, religious sentiment, as if Hindu sentiment matters more than Christian sentiment or Hindu or Muslim sentiment or any other kind of sentiment. I mean, what is the difference between Khalistanis who talk of Sikh sentiments and the BJP that talks of Hindu sentiment? These are all personal sentiments, and the state must have no religion. That was demonstrated by Jawaharlal Nehru when I was 10 years old, when he refused permission to the President of India to attend the inauguration of the rebuilt Somnath temple. And now we have the Prime Minister of India acting as the chief priest at a religious function which the four Shankaracharyas refused to attend because it was not in keeping with Hinduism. At least that has shown that Hindutva is a political philosophy, whereas Hinduism is a religious way of life.
You proudly stated that people who come from Doon School or study in Doon School all have the same principles of secularism and equality and so on and so forth. And you had Naveen Patnaik, Amrinder Singh, Kamal Nath as your mates. But there were a few who did study in Doon School and who crossed the line and went the other way. You have Jyotiraditya Sindha now, Jitin Prasada, for instance. So that's also happening. And those.
There's a major generational change.
Yeah.
I now find that the classmates whom I assumed to have been secular because they never expressed any view or any other view, now that we've formed a club called the Diamonds, because we've experienced the Diamond Jubilee of our passing the Senior Cambridge exam, I now find that at least 3 or 4 of them were closet communalists then.
Right.
But they didn't dare express their view. Whereas now, I find the current generation of Doon School boys, and when I say the current, I go back to the 90s, that from the 90s onwards, it has become fashionable to proclaim your Hindudom and to base your politics on your Hindudom, and that is why I fear for the future of the country, not because I am going to suffer the kind of Nazism that is in the works, but because I'm sure my children will have to face it. They already are. 2 of them have already come under the laser lights of the communalists. My eldest daughter went on fast in protest against building a temple on the debris of a deliberately demolished mosque. The result was that the president of my resident welfare association sent me a letter asking me to leave the colony. So, and my second daughter has a problem. She's the president from the age of 38 of the Center for Policy Research, which is probably India's leading think tank. That is being demolished, like the Babri Masjid was, by the same people who destroyed the Babri Masjid. So we are already as a family facing this. And one of my colleagues in the Foreign Service, a girl who stood first in her batch, and therefore I was a great admirer of hers, has actually asked me to go to Pakistan to live there, and to take my daughter with me. I never believed that the Foreign Service could contain elements like this. A lady who stood first in her batch back in 1969. But that is what we are reducing India to, and that is what we have to fight against.
I'd also like to now dwell a little bit on your days in Pakistan, which you briefly mentioned, and the time you had there. And to this day, you still wonder how to answer your wife's fundamental question, whether Pakistan is an enemy country or not, because of the days you spent in Karachi and other parts of Pakistan. And just for the benefit of those who will read the book later and not yet, there's some wonderful anecdotes of time spent with people in Karachi, families there who welcomed him, fed him. There were times when he hardly had to eat at his own home because of so many invitations. Then about his driver Sattar, who became his lifelong friend of sorts, and so on and so forth. And there are some lovely chapters there. I'll let him respond to this, and then I'm going to read a few lines from some of the passages that I read, which led me to ask this question, but over to you.
Well, for me, the revelation came within the first hour of my reaching Karachi. I landed at the airport at about 1 o'clock, and must have been about 2:30 or 3 that I was in the office. Our whole building, which is a massive 3-story building, was being repaired because it had not been used for the better part of 13 years. That's after the 1965 war. And so all of us, from the driver to me, were in one room with one telephone between us. The telephone rang, and my clerk picked it up and announced to my astonishment that it was from the office of the Deputy Commissioner of Sakkar. Now, it's just not done for a civil servant to ring up the representative of a foreign country without going through his foreign office. So I was a bit intrigued about this call. I asked the clerk to give me the phone, and the man at the other end said that he was the liaison officer to a Hindu sant who had returned to Upper Sindh, a place called Sardbela, in order to give religious instruction to a rather large body of Hindus who live in Upper Sindh. That had been arranged by L.K. Advani the previous month. So that was the background. And he says, "Sir, I am the liaison officer to your Hindu sant." So I said, "Yes, what's the problem?" He says, "Sir, only you can save me. I have a big problem on my hands. I wanted to ask, what is your problem? You haven't told me. He said, my problem is that your Hindu son's Muslim murids want to meet him and get his blessings. So I said, yes. He says, sir, can you give me permission to do so? So my first job in Karachi was to give permission to the Muslim murids of a Hindu saint to meet him and take this Hindu saint's blessings. Now, if that was not a bouleversement, a reversal of everything I'd been taught about Pakistan, nothing could be. Then a few days later, I was invited to lunch, to dinner by a Pakistani friend. Sunit was with me. We got there and I had a rather taciturn gentleman sitting to my left. So to open conversation, I asked him a very banal question. I said, have you ever been to India? He said, yes, and then shut up. So to encourage him further, I said, oh, you've been to India, so where have you been? He said, Meerut, and then shut up. So I said, Meerut, and how long were you there? And he said, 3 years. At that point, I realized he was a prisoner of war. And so my face fell. And seeing my face fall, he said, would you and your wife come to dinner with us tomorrow night at the Sindh Club? They have an excellent port laid down in their cellar. But as a Muslim, I can't sign for it. But you can, but I'll pay the bill. And so we went and we had this dinner with him. And we were walking back home in the moonlight when Sunit, my wife, was sitting here. She turned to me and said, this is an enemy country, right? It's a question I didn't answer then. It remained reverberated in my mind for all my 3 years in Pakistan. And it's now 40 years or 42 years since we returned from Pakistan. In these 42 years, I've been back to Pakistan 40 times, at least. And I'm still to answer her question. If it is an enemy country, then why is it that I'm given such a warm welcome there, that my wife is given such a warm welcome, that our daughters, particularly the eldest one, who was about 6 or 7 years old when we left there, has such tremendous memories of Pakistani artists in their hundreds coming to my home. I was last week in Lahore and somebody said, I've come to your house in Karachi. I said, really? He said, you showed us Garam Hawa. I remember that. Yeah. But how could a man who's seen Garam Hawa in my house meet me not in Karachi but in Lahore, and that too nearly 50 years later, and remember as one of the treasured memories of his life that he saw Garam Hawa, which is of course a film about getting visas, in my home all those years ago. So I said in Karachi what I've said in the book, that our single biggest asset in Pakistan are the people of Pakistan, because they constitute a constituency for peace which is larger than any Indian constituency for peace. And this was distorted by ANI, another example of the Modi Godi, into saying that Pakistan is India's biggest asset, says Shankar Aiyar. And the result is that there are these lunatics, who get onto the social media and go on attacking one for what one has not said. I was trying to say that why do we, if we have disagreements with the government, why do we take it out of the people? The people want us. The governments may not. And the only way of dealing with the government of Pakistan is not to have the courage to do surgical strikes on Pakistan or air attacks on a crow in Balakot, but to have the courage to sit across a table and talk to the Pakistanis. For 10 years, God bless you, for 10 years, we have not had the courage to sit across a table and talk to the Pakistanis. The excuse we make is that talks and terror can't go together, whereas the fact is that it is only through talks that you can end terror, because nothing suits the terrorists better than an atmosphere of tension between India and Pakistan. So
Absolutely wonderful, yes.
these are the kind of simple truths which emerged from my years there.
With your permission, I'd like to read two paragraphs which follows this lovely evening you had at the Sin Club where you signed for the port wine. I'll just read just to move on from what he said, but these are very, very interesting and lovely lines. He says, the evening surprises, evening being the evening at the Sin Club, did not end there. I had sent my driver on other duties, so Zafar, his host, assured me that he would have us dropped home. I clambered into a car driven by somebody who introduced himself as Brigadier Jimmy Akhtar Aziz. In the course of conversation as he drove us, Jimmy said he had served in the Lahore sector in one of the most bitter engagements of the 1965 war. Fiddling with his wireless, he came across the Indian commander deploying his troops on the other side. Recognizing the voice as that of Kapoor, one of his course-mates at the Indian Military Academy, he cut into the wavelength and exclaimed, "Arey Kapoor, Jimmy here. I beat you at everything in the academy and I'll beat you again tomorrow." So then Mr. Aiyar writes, Kapoor apparently responded with a hearty laugh, and this they called war. And then he says, after we returned home from dinner, Suneet turned and asked me, "This is supposed to be an enemy country, right?" It was a question that haunted me through my 3 years in Karachi and continues to haunt me. Is Pakistan? So the thing is, a lot of his Indian friends kept on asking him whether he felt uncomfortable being followed in Pakistan, because all diplomats have a shadow. So he writes, Indian friends and colleagues serving in Islamabad would ask how I coped with being followed everywhere. I would patiently explain, I never let on that I know I'm being followed. I take only one precaution. Before slipping into bed, I raise the cover to check whether it really is my wife or an intelligence guy in drag.
May I just read? Since he's done me this honor of reading from the book, I want to read a couple of passages which illustrate, I think, everything I have to say about Pakistan. My faithful driver, Abdul Sattar, for once did not turn up on time one morning. When he arrived about a quarter of an hour later, I blew up. He explained he had been delayed because he had to go to the police thana to rescue his brother, who had been arrested the previous night for illegally projecting Hindi films in Delhi colony. He said he had gone to the thana and requested the duty constable to let off his brother. The constable brushed him off, saying, "Tum ho kaun?" Drawing himself to his full 6 foot height, Sattar replied, मैं तो हिंदुस्तान के कौंसल जनरल का ड्राइवर हूँ. He said, हिंदुस्तान के कौंसल जनरल के ड्राइवर? He said, हाँ. He said, तब आप अपने भाई को ले जा सकते हैं. I've never been paid a greater compliment. But on my last night, and this is the last thing, on my last night in Karachi, as I lay awake in bed, going over my memories of the last 3 years, I suddenly realized that I had, after all, held a post of great importance to the local populace, and it was perhaps this, plus the hospitality embedded in Pakistani culture, that had led to the overwhelmingly warm and friendly reception I had received. But what if the junior staff? Had their experience been different? So the next morning, after reaching my office for the very last time, I sent for the official who had flown into Karachi from London on the night of the same day as I had. reminding him of the fact that our stay in the city had been coterminous, I asked him how he had fared personally. He knew that I had been unusually fettered, but how had his own treatment been? He was slightly taken aback, but said that he'd not had any problem. What, I asked, of his colleagues, the army of 120 or so low-profile clerks in the visa section. He replied that none of them had a problem or suffered any indignity. That, I remarked, might have been because in public places no one could tell whether they were Indians or Pakistanis. They looked alike. But what about your wives? They wore saris, no? And a bindi, yes? And took the bus from outside Panchsheel Park, the Indian officials' ghetto, to do their daily shopping at Sadar. They were unmistakably Indian. How had they been treated? With a puzzled frown, because he could not understand why he was being asked these questions, he said he'd not heard of anyone staring or glaring at them or being unfriendly or abusing them. I was now ready for my final question. Reassuring him once again that his answers must be honest and would not go beyond the two of us, I asked whether it was true that the Indian staff would invariably be offered discounts when they went shopping. He hesitated and then he nodded. Were they given these discounts because they were from the consulate or because they were Indian? Because, he said, we are regular customers and because we are from India. So I summed up. You've been here exactly as long as I have, and we've both been treated with friendliness. Your ladies have been treated with honor, and you received discounts in Sadar. None of you has ever been treated rudely. So, should we make friends with Pakistan? He looked utterly shocked. वो कैसे हो सकता साहब? सब तो मुसलमान हैं. I ended the interrogation. This was the root of the problem. So you can see why only a secular fundamentalist can seek friendship with Pakistan.
I will now quickly move to the next book, or shall we say the extension of the first book. And, the Rajiv I knew, and this book also is extremely riveting, serious, and has a lot to unpack. Before we get into the meat of this discussion, you worked obviously very closely with Rajiv in many ways. You say you were not his confidant but worked with him, but I feel in many ways, especially with regard to Panchayati Raj and other issues, he was. And you've taken great pains to clarify or to set the record straight on issues like the Shah Bano judgment and the bill that came after that, the act that came after that, then the whole controversy over the opening of the locks at the Babri Masjid, and Bofors, of course, you went into it. Before I just go into the specifics of that, you have underlined the fact that in many of these cases, Rajiv was either in the dark or he was unaware completely, and there were people like Arun Nehru and then Arun Singh and others who obviously tricked him into taking a lot of decisions. One would ask here is that aren't you being a little too soft on Rajiv there and making him, absolving him of his fundamental role as the Prime Minister who should be knowing it all? That's one thought I had.
I think it's a very valid question, and because it is really germane to the essence of the issue, my publisher refused to publish the Rajiv I knew and my comments on all his controversies until I had written an introduction which answers or attempts to answer precisely the question you asked. Please remember that until he was nearly 40 years old, Rajiv Gandhi had no interest in politics, or at least none that we knew of. He certainly had no political ambitions. His brother, on the other hand, was obviously designed by God to only be a politician. And the two brothers did not agree with each other at all. Yet when the younger brother died, Sanjay died, then his mother turned to him and more or less blackmailed him into quitting Indian Airlines, where he was a pilot, and become a politician. And he only had a probationary period of about 3 years before he was elevated to the highest post in the country with no political experience at all. And that was not because he asked for it. It was because his cousin, a distant cousin, but still a cousin, called Arun Nehru, was the political boss and really was a kind of mafia boss who had frightened the Congress party into accepting his role as the big voice in the Congress party and really a doppelganger for Indira Gandhi. So it was he who decided to put Rajiv on the throne in order that he might have a non-political prime minister whom he could manipulate. What he didn't know, or what he perhaps only got disillusioned about later, is that he was very BJP inclined. And he believed that it was only by trapping into the so-called Hindu vote that the Congress could assure itself of continuity, especially after the blowback and the setback that the Congress had had in the emergency. And it was he who picked up a totally local issue called the Ram Janmabhoomi. Perhaps the greatest Ram Bhakt we've ever had was Mahatma Gandhi. Did he ever mention the Ram Janmabhoomi? Until 1986, did most of you know that that Ayodhya, a tiny little town, was located in Faizabad district? It's not an issue known to others, but because Arun Nehru had his schooling and then his college in Lucknow, he was very aware of a local issue a few kilometers away. But Rajiv, like the rest of us, was a secular human being. And had he been asked whether the lock should be opened, he'd have definitely said no. And so, Arun used the opportunity provided by the death of the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh to get another puppet called Veer Bahadur Singh elected as the Chief Minister. And that was in November 1985. And almost the first thing he did, Veer Bahadur Singh did, was to visit Ayodhya. And that's been brilliantly described by a Hindutvist called Devki Nandan Agarwal, whom I've quoted at great length. And they hatched a plan which was based on a technicality that had escaped all our attention. The locks had been put on in 1949 December, and nobody had questioned the locks till 1985 December, except for some VHP activists. Now it was pointed out that the locks were not put on by judicial order, but by executive order of the government. So since they were put on by executive order, they could be removed by executive order. And then the local sessions judge was leaned upon by the government to, it's got 5 minutes left, she says, is leaned upon by the government to reopen the case. And when they reopened it, the senior superintendent of police said the locks are not necessary to maintain law and order. And the district magistrate was called, and he said the locks are not necessary to maintain law and order. And therefore, the sessions judge in Faizabad immediately passed an order saying that even as the locks have been put on by executive order, I'm issuing a judicial decision to remove the locks. And because this was anticipated, there was a large gathering of Hindu pilgrims at the Babri Masjid who were then informed of this within 5 minutes. And anybody who's been in association with the Indian law will know that court orders are not carried out that quickly. They swarmed into the premises and the Babri Masjid problem was created. And had Rajiv been asked, he'd have definitely said no. But faced with this fait accompli, he was left with no alternative but to try and find a solution. And from 1986 till 1989, the issue simmered, but it did not rise to the top. In 1989, because of Bofors and because of other subjects for which I don't
We don't have the time.
the
Yes,
time,
there's so much to talk about. Yes.
there was an atmosphere in which the Babri Masjid issue was brought to the fore, and instead of campaigning on his constructive achievements, of which there were numerous in the domestic sphere, including Panchayati Raj, constitutional Panchayati Raj, and his foreign policy initiatives, he was the only Indian Prime Minister in 30 years' time, and now that is more than 30 years since he went, in the 30 years to succeed. In other words, in the last 60 years, to visit both China and Pakistan on state visits. And he did both in exactly the same month of December 1988. The man was utterly remarkable in what he achieved, but all that got hidden with the Babri Masjid issue suddenly being converted into a national issue. And at that point, as I've said in my book, Rajiv Gandhi fumbled. He allowed himself to be dictated to by his colleagues who thought a soft Hindutva approach is the right one, and went against his own instincts, which were secular, to say that we'll do a Shilanyas on the undisputed area. But Bhutta Singh, the Home Minister, included a portion of the disputed area in the land which had been reserved for the Shilanyas, that is the foundation of the Ram Temple. And their strategy went wrong because the Hindus looked at the masjid and saw it was still standing and so voted against Rajiv, and the Muslims saw that he was building a temple and therefore they voted against him. And thus it was that his really brilliant political career was brought to a sudden end. So that is the tragic story of the Babri Masjid, which I've recounted in 5 minutes, but which is actually spread over about 60 or 70 pages
yeah.
in the book.
A quick devil's advocate question, but one of my last questions. I'll weave all these questions quickly. One is, having said all that, how could the Prime Minister of the country be bereft of any information of so much going on, which would ultimately put him into so much
I've
trouble?
just tried to make one thing clear to you, that so much was not going on. All that was going on was a conspiracy that involved going to the court and telling the court that the lock had not been put on by judicial order.
Okay.
That was all that was required.
Right.
And then getting the DM and the SSP to say that there is no law and order problem if you open the lock. And the lock then got opened. And that is what let the genie out of the bag and has resulted in the government we have today. But who could have foreseen? I don't think even Modi could have foreseen in 1986 that a simple physical act like opening the locks at a shrine where people would stand in front of the lock and worship Ram Lalla. They were doing that in huge numbers, would make such a big psychological difference. It changed India from being a secular country into becoming the communal country that India today is. And that could not have been foreseen, I suspect, by Lord Ram himself.
I'll just take a minute more. You've described him, and very rightly so, as compassionate, diligent, upright, bold, truthful, and basically he was very, very decent, and so on and so forth. Now the thing is, what about his son Rahul? I mean, if he Arguably, he perhaps has the same values. But why has he not been as successful politically and stringing this party together?
We are discussing my books.
Yes.
When I get around to writing my memoirs of Rahul Gandhi, I'll perhaps answer your question. But the fact is that whereas I knew Rajiv Gandhi really rather well and worked with him quite closely, I neither know Rahul nor have I worked with him closely. So it would be unfair to make a comparison between somebody whom I was deeply involved with and somebody with whom I've hardly at all been involved.
I'll just end with a very small anecdote. When he was very young, he and his brother were taken to meet. He and his brother, of course, were very young. They were taken to meet Mahatma Gandhi, and Mahatma Gandhi sat them, both of them, on his lap. So Mahatma Gandhi, they went to meet Mahatma Gandhi, and he and his brother, and they were sitting on his lap. And Mahatma Gandhi actually said, "ये दोनों हमारे चांद और सितारे हैं." आँखों के सूरज और चांद. I had it here, but there was no time to read it. So the thing is, we'll end with this in the sense that a person who's sitting here heard that from the Mahatma could probably never go wrong. And I think the seeds of secularism, equality, and basic decency were sown right then. It was an absolute pleasure, though it was cut short and there was so much to unpack. But in these 40 minutes, I'm sure we've traversed a good path.
Thank you all very much.